We're live this week on the podcast for the very first time. We are taping in front of a live audience with two of the biggest authors of the fall season. First up, Lisa Brennan-Jobs talks to us about her debut book, a memoir, Small Fry. Small Fry is a coming-of-age story about a girl growing up in the early days of Silicon Valley, the daughter of two very young parents, including a father, Steve Jobs, who initially refuses to acknowledge paternity and eventually becomes, of course, one of the richest and most celebrated people in the world. But this book is her story. Then in fiction, Gary Shteyngart will tell us about his latest novel, Lake Success, published to great acclaim in early September. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. So Lisa Brennan-Jobs, a debut memoirist. This book has gotten rave reviews. It's been out for a while now. It came out on September 4th. How does it feel so far?
My son has had most of his life while this book has been out. It feels amazing to put a book of your entire life out to other people and then to realize that it's become their book now. So people come back to me with reactions to the book saying like, it's about this or it's about that. And I think, no, it's not quite. And then I think it's your book now, even though it's my family and my embarrassing stories in my life. So it's been gratifying. And I feel sometimes like I'm on the outside of it, watching other people have very strong reactions to my family. And so in that sense, it's been a joyful experience and also kind of a frightening experience. And it has been everything that I dreamed of when I started writing this book, that people would have profound reactions, that they would find pleasure in it, that they would find they couldn't stop reading. And yet, since it's been out, I do feel a little bit on the outside as if I'm watching other people rather than in it.
Have you been surprised by reader reactions?
Last night I was at the Harvard bookstore doing a reading. I think it was the last event on the tour for me. And 3 people came up to me and cried about different parts of the book. A mother cried about my mother's character in the book, and a man who was a father teared up, and a woman cried as well about her relationship with her father. So I've been very surprised at how strong the reactions are. And then also some people have said they've stayed up all night reading it. And I didn't design it to be a page turner, but I like the idea that someone couldn't stop.
Have you always wanted to write a memoir, or were you like secretly wanting to write a novel and this book just came out instead?
Oh God, I was desperately trying not to write a memoir. And it took a long time, probably longer than it would have otherwise to write, because I didn't want to write it. It seems a little cringeworthy to be the kid of a celebrity and be writing a memoir. I thought, oh God, no, anything but a memoir. But these stories kept on coming up for me, and they were more vivid and they were more pressing than other stories. And I like to write nonfiction because it feels like it gives me bones to hang lyricism on or feelings on. So I knew I wanted to write something nonfiction, but I was just hoping to write something before this so that people would think, oh, she's a writer, before they would think, oh, she's a memoirist, or oh, she's the daughter of Steve Jobs. But this story felt a little bit like it was the dam that was holding back other stories and other books. And if I didn't write it, then I wouldn't be able to write them, because these questions would keep on coming up. I think questions of shame and legitimacy. So I embarked upon the project of writing this book to understand whether I was legitimate and whether I was worthy. And of course, maybe those kind of projects begin in a sort of cringy fashion because you're feeling unworthy and then you're berating yourself for writing what could be a celebrity memoir. And so everything is seeming to confirm your own bias, and you have to kind of fight through it.
To what extent were you conscious of packaging of it, sort of thinking it, writing it as a celebrity child memoir?
I was very conscious that the margin for error would be slim. So that meant that at the slightest whiff of looseness or gossip or celebrity memoirishness, it would be consigned to that category. So with Grove and with my editor, Elizabeth Schmitz, we were very careful to try to represent it again and again as the book that it is. I think people almost didn't have a space in their brain for the fact that a memoirist was born into this kind of a family. And so again and again, we've been trying to assert it through the cover design. I really didn't want my father on the cover of my book and wanted a certain femininity. At the same time, I think sometimes people do buy this book because they're really interested in Steve Jobs. And then at first I was very upset by that because I thought, oh no, they're going to be so disappointed. They'll buy it for that and they'll get this. But now I've been thinking, they think they're buying this book about a man, and in fact, they're buying the story of a coming of age of a girl. And maybe it's a book they wouldn't normally have bought, but maybe they'll love it, and that will open something up.
So you had some trepidation about writing about your father. Were you also scared to write about yourself in such an intimate, personal, way where it's flaws and all?
Yes, my flaws and all are there. So when I first started writing years ago, I wasn't really appearing on the pages, which is kind of an interesting metaphor if you're writing a memoir and you're not appearing on your own pages. I would write a scene, and the scene might have been interesting about other people in my life, but who was writing it and who was she seemed to sort of go away. During this process, I read Tobias Wolff's This Boy's Life, and I noticed that the more devious young Tobias was and the more mischievous and bad and practically criminal he was, the more I loved him. So I thought, I guess maybe it's okay to start to talk about the places where I was the most shameful, and maybe I can write them. And then as I wrote them, I started appearing on the pages. So it was kind of like a process of uncovering myself by illuminating my own warts and flaws. And the other thing about that is that you can't really write honestly about other people in any way unless you're willing to write honestly about yourself. And there were definitely stories in the book I thought I would never tell anybody. And then I wrote them, and in fact, they didn't seem so bad. So then,
was there anything in particular that you thought just it will never get in there, but it did?
There's a scene later in the book about going to my Harvard interview and sort of scrappily using whatever I can to get in. And I thought, I can't write that. Then they'll really know. I didn't deserve to be there. As I was, the beginning of the book, I'm going through my father and stepmother's house and sort of pilfering these odd, used, kind of useless objects. And as I was doing that, I thought, this is weird. I'm going to write about this. This is bizarre. This craving for these odd, useless things. So I knew I would be able to say that, and I could package that well. But the Harvard story, and other times, even when I was younger in elementary school, and I would kind of, whenever I was feeling a little lost, kids don't have much to sort of stand their identity on because they haven't done much yet. So you use what you've got. If it's nice sneakers, or in my case, if it's that your father's famous. And so I would use it sometimes. And even that I found embarrassing. When I look back, I thought, oh God, what an embarrassing kid. So that was also part of what I didn't want to write about. And then when I wrote it, I thought, it's not so bad.
There's another great moment where you're writing about a very moving scene between you and your mother, where you talk about your father and the Lisa computer. And then you say, and I thought this was the perfect opportunity to ask for a kitten, which sort of
make a play for a cat.
That's right.
The selfishness of it. Yeah.
I want to go back to the start of the book with that beginning with stealing things from your father's house, which is such a risky maneuver because you're kind of setting yourself up as asking us to judge you or disapprove of you in a weird way on the very first page. And obviously there's a kind of metaphor there in taking things out of his home. But why did you choose to begin that way?
Well, part of the metaphor, and maybe this is what you're talking about, you probably know, is just the idea of memoir as theft. That you want to write your own story, and maybe you need to write your own story, because why would you put yourself through this if you didn't? But in writing your own story, you're necessarily dragging up in your net all the stories of all these other people. and they didn't ask to be written about necessarily. And then your obligation is to be kind and to be as honest as you can and to be fair and to write them meaningfully, I think. But they didn't have a choice in the matter, and it feels a little like you're stealing as a matter of course. And then when I wanted to take these objects, I thought perhaps I had felt between me and my father that things were not yet complete. And that I felt maybe even ripped off in some way. And that this burning desire to take these things was this misguided attempt, obviously subconscious, to kind of even the scales. I think that was what was going on. But I decided to start it with that because I felt like a criminal almost writing about other people. Are we allowed to write about other people if we need to write about ourselves? I don't know. I mean, there was this scene early in the book. When I first started writing, it was later. My mother and I are in the car together, and it's night, and it's raining. And she's yelling. She's not yelling at me, but she's yelling at her life. And I'm only 4. And I remember this very well, and I talked about it with her after I wrote the scene. But it's very violent, and it's very sad. And I was scared to put it so soon, so early in the book, because I thought, oh no, people will judge her before they even know her. And later it did seem okay to put it earlier in the book. And some mothers have come up to me and said, I am that woman. People that look otherwise quite put together, in fact. I thought, oh. But was it fair to take that story of my life in which my mother does not look so great?
How did she feel about it?
I gave her a copy of the book before publication. And it's an interesting question how much responsibility we have to the people we've written about. You know, do you not give them a copy and let them be angry at you? Is that the responsible thing to do? Or do you give them a copy? But I thought with my mother, because she'd encouraged me to write this book so much, and because she believes in honesty, that she could handle it. But it was days of getting very upset text messages. It would go up and down. I'd get one that would say, this is absolutely incredible. And then the next one would be, this isn't true and I can't stand it and I can't believe you put it in the book. And then by the time she got to the end, she'd reached a place of some equanimity. About that scene, I think she said to me, I remember at the time knowing that you were old enough that you would remember it. That I was 4 and I would remember that night. Maybe there'd been other nights I hadn't remembered, but that night I would remember. And she said she remembered at the time feeling quite devastated, but that her feelings of hopelessness overtook her. So that she felt that the book was true, but I think she also felt it was a horrific experience to read in parts. I think it's very difficult to read about oneself from the perspective of another.
There's so much dialogue in the book from when you were growing up. I was wondering if you spoke to your mother about it while you were writing. Did you try to do some kind of reporting on your own life to reconstruct those scenes, or did you rely purely on your own memory?
I thought that the book was just going to come streaming out of me, this small, eloquent volume of truth, and it was just going to come easily. And in fact, it didn't. I couldn't remember many of the stories at first, and I had to sort of start with all of the stories that connected to this part, and then more, and then I was able to remember more stories. And then after a while, I had a whole constellation that connected, but not all of the stories were necessary for the book. And then I had to create a timeline and sort of hang the stories on the timeline. And I was able to create a timeline more easily because my father is a public figure, which was very helpful. And then I spoke with a lot of people, and that triggered my memory further. And I shared stories I'd already written with them to make sure that I was getting at something that was true and felt and received validation that I was. And then I wrote more, talked with more people, and then had the book fact-checked as well. I think with memoir, you have the license to write scenes, which means that I'm trying, instead to tell you how it was, I'm trying to let you live in my life a bit.
How did you have it fact-checked?
Which means that I had to have dialogue.
Yeah. How did you have it fact-checked? I mean, were they questioning you on your own recollections? How did that work?
So the fact-checker had worked for a number of magazines, mm-hmm. and it wasn't legal fact-checking, which is what they do as a matter of course. It was actual fact checking, which I think is a bit different.
Mm-hmm.
So they go through, and if you say something like, we walked from Palo Alto to Menlo Park and it took 40 minutes, they say, no, but I've checked and it actually takes 20 minutes to take that walk, things like that. Most of which seem kind of irrelevant. In fact, the fact checker was saying, I found this other fact, you should include it. And I thought, no, I've lived it. I know that other fact is true. I decided not to include it. So they can get a little pedantic. And occasionally with a fact checker, they'll bring up something that's factually inaccurate and you'll realize that the story is slightly different than you thought. And so that was what I was hoping for, that I would get a few in. But I guess the question you asked is about dialogue. And the dialogue, I just had to rely on my own memory and talking with other people about it. And I did find when I talked to other people about the stories that they remembered similar things. My husband is reading the newest Karl Ove Knausgaard, My Struggle, book 6, because he's read all the others. And I know Karl Ove received like multiple letters from family members about his book and saying it was wrong. But I have to say the majority of feelings that I've gotten, the majority of responses I've gotten from people I know, from people who were there, have been, oh my gosh, it is exactly the way I remember it.
So there is a major factual record out there on your father. He was a very public figure, books, movies, many articles written. Was there something true about him that was not in all of that media representation that you really wanted to come through in the book?
I wasn't writing this book to clear up any record about my father. I happened to be born to these people and in this family. And so I was writing this book from the perspective of a daughter and a complicated family. And I don't really know what the public record about my father is so much because I don't track it. I'm not a Steve Jobs completionist. Didn't watch the expositions that he did except for when I was there, when I was invited myself. So it wasn't so much that I wanted to correct the record. I think that it was that I wanted to bring you viscerally into the experience of my life, of having the parents that I had. And I think there have been many writings about my father, but I imagine few of them include so many scenes that are feelings-based and so many scenes of family. I think there are more joyful scenes and sweet scenes, and also intensely difficult scenes, perhaps, because they're so visceral in this book than are in other places. But I don't know because I haven't seen so much of the public record.
You had your first baby like almost exactly at the same time that the book came out. I'm sure that was carefully planned. But I'm curious, has becoming a parent yourself affected the way that you think about your own story?
I'm so new to being a parent and so sleep deprived that I have no particular great wisdom at this point. But I did wait. I did want to wait to have a family until I had done at least the majority of this work and gotten it out of me. My mother kept on saying it's important to come to terms with your history so you don't repeat it or unconsciously repeat it. And I think I did have a desire to understand what had happened in the granular detail and a lot of the feelings that perhaps had been missed so that I could choose how to be a parent and how to have my own family. But right now I'm kind of in the mess of it. And it's so joyful, my God. But also it's so sleep depriving. And I do have a lot of compassion for my parents, but I think I developed a lot of that while I was writing the book. I got to live with them for a while. I got to time travel to when they were younger than I am now and see things more from their perspective and see things with more of a panoramic view. And so I think that my compassion grew while I was writing the book, perhaps even more than it has grown since I've had a child.
All right, this is going to sound like a very cruel last question since you just told me how sleep deprived you are. But, when the book came out, it was very clear that you wanted to be viewed not just as the daughter of Steve Jobs, not just as a memoirist, but really as a writer, and to have the book seen as a work of art for the writing itself. So I'm assuming you identify as a writer. What do you plan on writing next?
Oh, I have no idea. Only that It won't be about me, and it will be nonfiction, and it won't be about me. Did I say that already?
All right. Well, we're very glad this book is about you, Lisa. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
Lisa Brennan-Jobs, author of Small Fry. All right. Thank you. So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Our next guest, Gary Shteyngart, author not only of Lake Success, but of Super Sad True Love Story, Absurdistan, The Russian Debutante's Handbook, and Little Failure, a memoir. Thank you so much, Gary, for being here.
Oh, thank you.
Well, let's make a natural segue here from memoir to memoir before we go into the novel. How does it feel to get back to fiction after writing about yourself for an entire book?
Well, people have made the comment that I've written about myself for 4 entire books because my first 3 novels were about small, furry Soviet Jews, and I am obviously one of those. And so the memoir was, for me, a kind of palate cleanser because if anyone's read that, everything you'll ever need to know about me, I mean, TMI, is all in that book. So this enabled me, it gave me the opportunity to write about a character who wasn't a Soviet Jew, but just a Jew, you know. So baby steps. Barry Cohen is the protagonist.
Although we established that there are some odd commonalities between you and Barry, the watch collecting being one of them.
Yeah.
Yes, it was revealed. But before we get too much into Barry, I want to start with something that comes out very clear from the beginning of the book, which is politics. We have our president named within the first few pages. Is this a Trump era novel?
I hope not. I mean, I hate that designation, and the reviews of all, so many of the reviews are one of the first novels in the era of Trump. And I mean, I guess that's a factual thing. But for me, all novelists want is to write about, I think, family. The family is the really big topic, how partners relate to one another, how children relate to parents, parents relate to children. But the book is set in 2016, and there was no way I could ignore the fact that, of course, the certain cataclysmic events have happened in our nation's history.
Did you start writing it after the election?
I wrote the book, so I started this draft in June of 2016, and I ended it on December 21st, 2016, which happens to be the shortest day of the year, which I think
That's also a very fast book to write.
Usually I labor quite a bit, but I had written a horrible book. I was 160 pages into a really horrible book before that. It was an international thriller. Can you imagine me writing an international thriller?
I forgot about the international thriller.
God,
Is that ever going to come out?
No, never.
No.
We
were looking forward to the international thriller.
Yeah, it was great. I gave it to my editor. It was 160 pages, and she's such a sweet person. She came back with 160 pages of notes. And I was like, yeah, okay, maybe it's time to let this go. But I started and the engine of the book is a Greyhound trip that I took across the country, which I started. So I wrote a lot of this while being on the Hound, or the dog as we call it. So started in June and ended the trip in September. And, Trump sort of weaseled his way as he does into the book, because by the time I got on in June in New York, I thought, wow, this is just, the Trump thing is a sideshow. The GOP has made a really stupid mistake. By the time I got off in September, I was pricing, Montreal real estate. So, and it was a lot of the people on the Hound and during the trip, and a lot of this went into the book, that told me, you're absolutely wrong. They told me she's going to lose Pennsylvania. I was like, are you kidding? Look at 538, But, yeah.
So you discovered America along with Barry.
Yeah, I was taught America.
Yes. Did you experience post-Trump angst? Like, did you think, whether the novel, what role does humor play now? How can I be funny when the world is not funny?
It's a problem. Every time Sarah Huckabee Sanders gets on the stage, I mean, that's dystopian fiction. There's nothing I can add to that that'll make it any worse. I mean, in 2016, I published a book, Super Sad True Love Story, right, which was set in America, driven by a social media-driven crypto-fascist regime, right? And here we are, And as bad as things got in Supersat, I wouldn't imagine, I was writing it between 2006 and 2010, 2006, 2009. As bad as things were, I wouldn't imagine children being ripped from their mother's arms, and warehoused. I mean, that was beyond my remit, if you will.
Right. Well, we'll get to that. I want to get to immigration later, which I think also obviously plays a role, even though you sort of left it behind a little bit, but not entirely.
Not entirely.
But let's go to hedge funds, because that is a big part of this book. And you are not a former hedge fund manager. How did you decide to make your protagonist a hedge fund manager?
Well, so after my failed international thriller, I thought, okay, let's stay closer to home. And I started to look around Manhattan. I live in Manhattan. I can't afford Brooklyn. And I thought, who the hell lives here? Because all my friends had left for a long, they were in Berlin or Abu Dhabi, or a lot of them are in the Mid-Hudson Valley, where I actually also spent half the year in the greater Rhinebeck area, Metro Rhinebeck. And so I started looking around, noticing who was around me, and almost everyone, I started going to the sort of douchey, can I say that word? Yeah, douchey bars around me, and everyone seemed to be working in finance. So then I started to make friends with them. I have a friend who's a lovely reporter. She used to work for Bloomberg. Now she's at Barron's, Mary Childs, just a great reporter. And she knew a lot of these people, and some of these people actually liked my work, although a lot of them had also grossly misinterpreted it.
I was going to say, did they like it in the right way?
Well, no. I mean, some of them thought Super Sad True Love Story was a critique of the Obama administration, which it so wasn't. Somebody told me that there was a group of tax cheats on the Virgin Islands who were reading Super Sad as their book group choice, So all this was very strange, but I quickly became friends with them, and they really welcomed me with open arms. And I became kind of the hedge fund whisperer. Like, they would entrust me with all the private things they couldn't tell their friends, because they really didn't have any friends. Their friends were all their enemies.
So just as they misunderstood your novels, did you understand what they were talking about when they talked about finance?
So I did do a lot of research. I mean, in the other life I hadn't led, I probably would have been a journalist. And this book is essentially The Ride on the Greyhound. The hedge fund stuff was just an act of very careful journal taking. So I spent about 4 years researching hedge. So, in the thriller that didn't make it, the protagonist was also a hedge fund person.
So all that research wasn't for naught.
All that research wasn't for naught. Right. So I did begin to realize. But look, I mean, hedge funds are very complex, obviously, but there's something very simple about them. They're a scam for the most part. Not all of them, but so many of them are. I mean, it's a way to take money from people. Our tax system is already set up to help them, and even more so under the current president. But it's also, the hedge fund is the 2 and 20 is the sort of the catchphrase here. 20% of profits they get to keep, but also 2% of any asset you give them. So if I have a hedge fund, you give me $100 million, I keep $2 million, even though I can lose the other $98 million for you. So it's a win-win proposition.
It's a nice gig if you can.
It's a great gig. And so many of them, in 2016 and 17, a lot of these funds really began to slide in comparison to the S&P, which was doing great. So essentially it was, they would get super drunk with me and tell me, Gary, don't ever invest with me. Low-cost index funds, that's where you want to be. So I thought, wow, I'm a part of this amazing scam.
Little did they know how much novelists make.
Yeah. It was embarrassing not having a plane.
So for those here who have not yet read the novel, and our listeners on the podcast, tell us a little bit about Barry Cohen and how you got to this character.
For me, comedy is, I think I'm X, but I'm actually Y. The discrepancy between who we think we are and who we really are, and we all share this quality, is enormous. But certain people have an even greater chasm between who they are and who they think they are. And that was very true, I think, of a lot of people I met in finance. I mean, they had no idea what was going on in the small world outside of their, Upper East Side apartment. One of the first people I met wasn't even a hedge funder. He was he worked for a large bank. He was a trader. And he said, Gary, I really feel bad for the middle class. And I said, yeah, me too. And he said, because I'm a part of it. And I said, really? And he said, yeah, I'm struggling. And I said, how do you define the middle class? And he said, well, just people earning between $2 and $4 million a year.
It's hard for us.
It's hard. And then he drew up a spreadsheet of how, where the money went. And he has, many children, many wives. But speaking of the wives, I mean, it felt like the whole world they lived in was affected. So one of the first people I met was the wife of a hedge funder who said to me, and I have a little kid, and we were the whole Manhattan thing about where to send your kid. And she said, you should send him to ethical culture. And I said, yeah, why? And she said, because it's so diverse. And I said, really? And she said, yeah, some of their kids, their parents, their dads aren't even hedge fund guys. They're just doctors or lawyers. And that, of course, made it into the book, as did a lot of the stuff. So it was really just me sitting there with a notebook taking these notes.
Do you go like incognito around the mid-Hudson Valley now that you've written about all these guys?
But here's the thing is nobody ever knows who they are.
Right.
So I wrote a novel called Absurdistan, which was about this 425-pound son of Russian oligarchs. And I had a friend who was the 425-pound son of Russian oligarchs, who was basically, that guy. And so he saw me walking down the street and he said, hey, I read Absurdistan. Who's that schmuck Misha?
Well, I want to go back to that idea of like nobody knows who they are, and that you think you're someone else, you think you're someone, and you find out you're someone else, because that's dealt with on many levels in the novel, not just with Barry, but also with his wife Seema, who at a certain point early in the novel says, what if this is who I am? And the book really seems to be a lot about that kind of about self-deception and about how we identify ourselves.
Yeah. Well, that was part of the process for me, was this idea of, so I wanted to make the book a duet. And I do this quite a bit. Super Sad was also a duet between two lovers, and this is a duet between two members of a failing marriage. And so I wanted her presence to be very, very specific. I wanted somebody who started out, and this is the other thing I learned about these hedge fund marriages, is that the wife was often quite a bit smarter than the husband, and also a lot more credentialed. She's the one with the Yale law degree or med school degree or et cetera, but still living it's almost like a feudal setup and she'll say, well, given the marginal tax rates, it makes no sense for me to work. I'll take care of my kids instead, make sure that they all get into Yale like I did. And this perpetuates a very strange cycle, because we think of New York, of Manhattan, Brooklyn as very progressive places. But when I stepped into hedge world, it really was not. But I wanted that conflict of who am I? She's the daughter of Indian immigrants. And throughout the book, it's very clear that she can go back to law and really make a difference. And she just doesn't do it, And part of it is, of course, that her son is autistic. So I do give her a little bit of slack there. She has a kid who's nonverbal autistic, and she's trying to raise him as best as she can. And obviously Barry's absconded and was absolutely useless even when he was present. So I wanted to create, again, going back to that idea that initially, so it's almost like a layer cake. The top layer for me is family. Underneath that, we have hedge funds. And somewhere beneath that is the politics of the country. And all three are interrelated, of course.
Right. And the identity question, going back to the politics, is dealt with not only on the individual level, but also as a broader tapestry. And very deliberately, it seems that everyone in the book is identified almost immediately by, race, ethnicity, class, or like putting people into categories.
Well, after at the end of this 4-year project, I would walk down the street and just sort of have like software running in my brain. Oh, this is worth this much. This person is worth that much, because that's how they see the world. And if you want to sort of identify with that kind of character, that's really what happens. But, the political aspect of it was all these people who run these funds, they all think they're not just geniuses at their job. And frankly, if you look at their lifetime P&L, profit and loss, they've lost hundreds of millions, if not billions, for their investors. They've had one or two really great bets. And because of that, they feel like, oh my God, I'm a brilliant, brilliant person. But they try to they think that means that they can be also policy mavens. They can, start charter schools. They can do whatever they want, And we're a kind of country that rewards that. I mean, look who we elected as president, a businessman, so to speak, right? Who's lost hundreds of millions of dollars himself. So Barry, who also wants to be a part of the pie, he is a watch collector. So he wants to start the Urban Watch Fund, which will help young poor kids buy their first Rolex, and learn to take care of it. And then he has billionaire trading cards that have the statistics of the billionaires on the other side,
But with Barry, he is fundamentally someone who begins the novel. He's the guy who has all the power. He's a white man. He works in finance. He's Ivy League educated. He has the real estate. And it seems like you're asking the question of like, what happens if all at once all that power is taken away?
Yeah. I love shows like Billions. I think that's a great show. And I think that really explains hedge funds to the nth degree. But I kind of was wondering what would happen if I took a hedge funder and also stripped him of all these things. And for complicated reasons, Barry ends up on the hound with absolutely no money. And he has to beg for money at a certain point in the book. So, I kind of wanted that. But also I wanted to try a book. It's almost a challenge that I set for myself. I wanted to try a book so usually my characters are people trapped in a system, and that goes, whether it's my novels or even the memoir I wrote, it's trapped in a system means being trapped in the Soviet Union where I was born and spent the first 7 years of my life, or being trapped in Hebrew school where I spent the next 8 years of my life, which is the most frightening part of all. Trapped at even Oberlin College, as lovely and gooey as it is its own kind of system that has to be navigated, right? But here I wanted somebody who was so much a part of the system, controlled the system. And I was wondering, what can I do with a character like that? The goal isn't, the reader to love this character, but the goal is for the reader to be able to take out her scalpel and be able to dissect him alongside me.
Did you have sympathy for him from the get-go?
Well, the people I met reminded me of me in some ways. In fact, many of them were graduates of I went to this math and science nerd school, Stuyvesant High School, and many of them were graduates of Stuyvesant or Bronx Science. Many of them were first generation or immigrants like myself, had parents who probably beat the crap out of them if they brought home a 98 instead of a 99 or 100, And so there was something very familiar about that particular kind of striving. There was a chip on their shoulders that I really identified with. When I was young, grew up in Queens, I remember seeing the movie Wall Street thinking, God, this will save me from a lifetime of, because in America, being poor as we were was seen as a moral failing. Whereas no matter how you make your money, if you're wealthy, then you have that taken away from you.
Did you know when you began the novel where Barry was going and where he would end up?
Yeah. I did. I knew sort of the arc. Sorry, now I'm getting into TV talk. I knew the arc of his character pretty well. There's a great line in The Sopranos where, what's his name? Chris Moltisanti wants to be a screenwriter, and he's talking about arc this and arc that, and Paulie Walnut says, "You know who had an arc? Noah." So whenever I hear arc, I always think of that. But so I knew what arc Barry was sailing on, but it was the surprise really was the rest, the culture. The surprise was the election. Mm-hmm. And then I couldn't end the book quite the way I wanted to end it. With the election, I thought of the election as being a kind of, it's there to create atmosphere. So if you're making a movie set in the 80s, somebody will have a Rubik's Cube on the table. So here we have Trump hollering racist, misogynist crap on the, on every CNN monitor that you see when you're in a Greyhound station. But I couldn't end it that way after what had happened. And so without giving away what happens, the election begins to inform not just the path of our country, but also what happens to this family.
You mentioned that, in your earlier novels, you had these people in these systems and that you were doing something different with this book. Do you do that deliberately? Do you set out some kind of challenge with yourself with each book?
You gotta. You can't keep doing the same book over and over. This is what really, really scared me. And it's not that I may return to Russia as a subject because Russia is quite a subject these days. But, I just didn't want to be, and I love Philip Roth, and I loved what he did with Newark, and I think, and given the right kind of genius, I think you can do 22 books about that. Some of his books veered off course into London or Israel and stuff like that. But I really felt that, and also, what else changed, I think, is in living half the year upstate, I began to feel more connected to the sort of, I'm not saying that people in New York are less American than anyone else, but I began to feel this crazy Americanness that has always been, like I learned how to drive a car. I began to drive to malls, which I've never done before, and I would buy these Charmin, I believe it's called, family packs of it, gigantic. And just to buy it, and I would put it in the trunk and I would drive home with it. And there was a kind of completion to it. It's like I finished the journey. I got the Charmin.
Well, you said that the book is ultimately about family. So I want to go back to the autistic child and why choose that?
Yeah. There's a couple of reasons. I think I've always had an incredible kinship with people on the spectrum. And looking back to the horrors of Hebrew school, I realize now, and I don't want to be Mr. Retro Diagnosis, but I realized that a lot of the kids who were my few friends, back then I was known as the Red Gerbil because I wore this giant Soviet coat made out of gerbils. You can still see their heads sticking out. And, and the only kids that would play with me, and when I look back and think of their behavior, there was stereotypically autistic behavior, stimming, flapping, all of this stuff. And then throughout my whole life, I think I've been close to people on the spectrum. 2 years ago, the greatest thing happened to me. I had lunch with Temple Grandin, and wow. It was just incredible. She was hilarious. All those sort of stereotypes we think about people on the spectrum are just not true. This was a person who had a very different way of communicating, but she was so much more intelligent, creative, and even funnier than some of the people we were hanging out with at this conference full of creative people, supposedly.
But for Barry, in particular, the idea of having this autistic child seems to raise this question of what does my child say about me, and is this my legacy?
And it's not even him. Seema also hides, his wife also hides this from her parents because she sees this as a failure in front of her parents, these hard-driving immigrant parents, right? And Barry thinks the same thing, And this is something I found among hedge fund people, is this idea of perfectionism. One of the schmuckiest things that Barry says in one of the first chapters when he and Seema get into a fight is he said, I married you for your young eggs, or something like that.
Right.
So it was her credentials, her genetics, the young eggs. She's younger than he is. He's 28. And he has this dream of having, in his Rhinebeck home, having 3 Duravit sinks next to one another where his 3 children will mirthfully play and splash one another and everything will be great. And then, of course, he can't handle the fact that his child, who is a lovely kid, who has his own arc, so to speak, throughout the book, but is not the perfect child that is not his idea of perfection.
All right, I want to end with a little game here because you have a kind of exciting Hollywood sideline thing going on. Can we talk about any of that?
We could talk about, I just consulted for Succession, the HBO series, which has been amazing. I love being in a room full of writers. Writers, usually we're hiding out in our garrets but I'm not the shyest person. I'm not the shyest writer I know by a mile. So I actually enjoyed sitting in a room. It's like a big think tank. And, for example, all the research I did into hedge funds, we would just get people to come in and give us the whole spiel and all that research. Then I wouldn't have to spend 4 years hanging out with drunken, Wharton boys.
But the creator of that show, Jesse Armstrong, has written a novel. But did you feel like when you were with the TV writers that in the writer's room, these are different creatures from me? Or are you all kind of doing a similar?
I think I may be, I hope I am. I think I may be ambidextrous or whatever the term would be. I think I can do both. I really do. And, for each book I write, I create a trailer. For this book, I made a trailer with Ben Stiller where we run a hedge fund. You can look that up on YouTube. So, I've always loved that world. I really think that it's blossomed into something incredible. And Succession, please watch it. It's a great, great show.
So good. All right. So here's the thing, which is that my little game, which is tell me about what your idea would be for the movie of this book.
Wow. Well, it's hard for me to even, I see movies when they're really big, but I really think in terms of TV, and I think the short story is analogous to a film. You get a certain amount of time, finite time. But to me, I think these TV shows are just incredible. So yeah, what would it be? It would be sort of The Sopranos, but with Bloomberg terminals instead of guns.
All right. Well, I think we'll all watch. Gary, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Gary Shteyngart. Joining us now, my colleagues, Lauren Christensen, Lovia Garake, and Tina Jordan, all editors at the Book Review. Hey, guys.
Hi.
Lauren, let's start with you. What are you reading?
I am reading Cherry. It's a debut novel by Nico Walker. I am in a little book club. Aside from
we just found out about this, and some of us are feeling betrayed for not being in Lauren's
You let me know
book
if you're
club.
free on November 7th. It's our next meeting. This is the book that we're reading now, and incidentally, completely by coincidence, the last book we read was Small Fry. And so, we like to alternate months, fiction, nonfiction. And so this one was suggested. It's a debut novel, as I mentioned, by Nico Walker. It's a really unromantic portrait of sort of early 2000s America. This young man grows up in Cleveland, and he sort of suffers from this ennui, and he ends up going off to war in Baghdad, and he becomes an army medic. And he comes back. It's really this sort of reverse coming of age narrative, because he doesn't come back. He comes back a changed man, but definitely not for the better. And he becomes addicted to opioids. And eventually, he goes through all these misdiagnoses of bipolar disorder and anxiety, even though it's obviously textbook PTSD. And he starts robbing a bunch of banks. And that's all the plot that I'll give away, except to say that the very beginning of this novel starts out with a really interesting author's note, and I'll just read it really, really briefly. It says, "This work is a book of fiction. These things didn't ever happen. These people didn't ever exist." Except the fact that Nico Walker actually wrote this book from jail, where he's serving an 11-year sentence for robbing banks. He's also from Cleveland. The parallels are really quite obvious, and it's almost as if that epigraph just sets you up to think the exact opposite even before you've read the very first page. And so it's sort of, on the heels of a memoir that we just read, we were hoping for a novel. And I just keep thinking through every page that it's truly so autobiographical. And, I could just talk all night about that sort of arbitrariness of the distinction between fiction and nonfiction. So that's one reason I'm excited to talk about this book. I hope no one in my book club is upset that I'm pre-discussing it with you guys before the book club. Yeah. Another thing that I think is really cool about this book is I love stories with a backstory is that so since he wrote this from jail, there's this crazy thing. I don't know if everyone else knows about this except for me, but there's this thing called the Son of Sam law, which actually prohibits convicted criminals from profiting off of their crime through art. So someone tell me if I'm wrong on this, but if you can write a novel, it just can't be about your crime or something. There's so many questions to unpack there to me of sort of the point of art, right? And also the point of criminal justice reform. But so that was another reason why, I thought this was a good pick to talk about. But mostly I just really love the style. I think his voice is there's such a strong sense of character in this novel. He has this habit of saying something incredibly earth-shattering, or, he's almost died because of one of his overdoses. And then he just says, but that was whatever. And it's at first it's a tick that's annoying. And then you come to hang on it because you become so close to this character. And I think it's just one of those characters you're going to miss when the book is over because you get so close to them.
Just to follow up on what you said, I think what's crazy about that law is that, you're sort of stripped of everything when you go to prison, just in the way that it works right now. And then you're also stripped of your own narrative and your own story. And that just seems that's kind of scary to think about.
So, Olivia, you're supposed to be reading this book for your book.
Yeah.
Instead, what are you reading?
Instead, I'm reading Heads of the Colored People by Nafisa Thompson Spires. And it's a debut short story collection that was actually longlisted for the National Book Award this year. It came out in April. I feel like that's not correct, but it's an incredible short story collection. It's really funny, sort of in the voice of Paul Beatty and Danzy Senna in terms of using humor to think about the Black American experience and the quotidian aspects of middle-class life, particularly. The opening story, it sort of plays with these characters of telling about a crime and sort of the aftermath of a police brutality / crime thing from different perspectives. And each character, is sort of not the quote unquote typical Black person, whatever that may mean to you. But they sort of all come to this sort of tragic end and think about the crime in this really tragic way. One thing that I really like about this collection is not only her sharp use of humor and her great writing, but the way that she anchors each story with characters that have appeared in the story before. And that kept me really engaged because it sort of makes me think, until I get to the end, I'm not going to have a full picture of these characters. And so an example is this character named Fatima, who I feel most related to. And she starts out, she's one of two Black girls in her private school in California. And her and this other Black girl, their moms, get into this fight via war of letters. And so they each put a note into their daughter's backpacks. And then you sort of see Fatima grow up in the next story and you have her recollect that experience from her perspective while she's in a yoga class with another woman who's the only Black woman in the yoga class. And then you sort of learn that, she struggled with eating disorders and also this idea of being the only one and feeling that there's not enough room for there to be two Black people in the same space, but also not wanting to feel that isolation. And so, again, it just feels like I haven't gotten to the end quite yet, but I wonder if her character is going to come back and sort of what does that mean to be to have a full picture of this person. Tina, what are you reading?
So I've been tearing my way through Tana French novels because Stephen King recently reviewed the latest Tana French, The Wych Elm, for us, and I read that and loved it. Pamela and I share an obsession with that novel. But his review really interested me because he was calling out some of her previous books and talking about what connects her novels and what she brings differently to each one. And I started to realize, I thought I read all of Tana French, but maybe I actually haven't. And I actually hadn't read this one. It's called The Secret Place, and it takes place during one day at a private, expensive, all-girls boarding school on the outskirts of Dublin. And a year previously, a 16-year-old boy from a neighboring school has turned up dead on the property. The crime has never been solved. then one day on, I don't really know how to describe this. They kept calling it like an agony board or something, a bulletin board at the school where you could like anonymously post things, you know. I guess the headmistress thought it was like better than going on the internet.
That's highly dangerous.
I know, right? Somebody basically posts a picture of this boy and says, like, I know what happened. I know who killed him. And so it takes place over the course of a day as these two detectives are interviewing these cliques of teenage girls. And let me tell you, nobody lies like a teenage girl. And so it's absolutely fascinating. And they're all masters of like cruelty to one another, you know, the casual humiliation. There's so much at play, who's in power and who's not. And so I'm not at the end yet. So it's cutting back and forth between their interrogations of these young women with what happened the year previously. And every time I think I know where it's going and that I think I've figured out who's lying, I realize that I'm wrong. So I'm actually not sure where it's going. And that's one of the things I like best about her books, which is as much as they are crime thrillers, they're also psychological novels. Mm-hmm. Like they're about what make people tick. You know, I'm just going to have to make sure that I've actually read every single one for sure when this one's done. So what are you reading, Pamela?
So I just finished Rage for Fame, The Ascent of Clara Booth Luce by Sylvia Jukes Morris. It is the first in a two-part biography of Clara Booth Luce, who, if those of you are familiar with her, probably think of her primarily as a playwright, the author of The Women, which has been made into many, many movie versions and resurrected on Broadway and elsewhere repeatedly. And then later on, the second wife of Henry Luce, the founder of Time Inc. and Time Life, Fortune magazine. And then later on, a member of Congress, a Republican member of Congress representing part of Connecticut, Fairfield County. And then later on, an ambassador. And I had this book for a while. I have both parts. And the thing that made me pick it up was reading recently in Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, that Clara Booth Luce was a major fan of LSD. And I read that and sort of parked it in my brain in just like an area of questioning, like how did this person become like a serious acid dropper? And how do you reconcile that? So I went back to read the book, and it's fantastic. I highly recommend it. It's hugely gossipy and juicy. Clara Booth Luce was just this incredible woman of the 20th century, born in 1903. She died in 1987. And this first half takes her up only to her election to Congress. And there's so much more. She's kind of like a Zelig figure of the 20th century. So as a child actor, she is the stand-in for Mary Pickford on Broadway. She later goes on, she sleeps with everyone. She sleeps with Randolph Churchill. She sleeps with Bernard Baruch. She has like lovers all around the world. She was, of course, this globe-trotting journalist reporting from the front. And it's like every single place she is, and you turn the page and you're like, how is there now a photograph of her with Albert Einstein and Thomas Mann? Like she is literally everywhere. And yet, you know, this is a woman who was born to an unwed mother. Later on, the mother was essentially a prostitute for much of her life up in Harlem. And there were very few expectations of her. And she just had this incredible and unapologetic ambition. And as a woman character, I think she's just completely fascinating in that she really made no bones about it. You know, she was a groundbreaker in so many different ways. And you find yourself reading it and just thinking like, I didn't know that women did that back then. I didn't know that anyone could do that. And yet Clara Booth Luce did it all. So a lot of fun. My most fun thing, or one of the most fun things at the book review, is talking to these guys about what we're reading. We could do it all day, but we basically save it for the podcast. So thank you so much, Lauren Christensen, Livia Garake, Tina Jordan.
Thank you.
And thank you all for being here. And thanks again to our star guests, Gary Shteyngart and Lisa Brennan-Jobs. That was a special live book review podcast. Next week, we'll be back in our studio at the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Thanks for listening.